I think the statement from Penny Wong yesterday is really significant, where she said the way Israel defends itself matters. When we carried the resolution in the federal parliament, we specifically called for the observance of international law in all instances. Now, the concerns from the community, I think we're now in the order of 6,500 people who've died in these bombings. And that's before you get to the issues that are separate from the bombings, but potentially in terms of human rights, even more significant, which if you go back to the first days after October 7, when the Israeli Defence Minister referred to a complete siege, he used the term human animals, and he said there would be no food, no water, and no fuel into Gaza. Now, in my part of Sydney, people are not simply getting their information through the media, they're getting information directly from the ground on Gaza. It's coming through WhatsApp groups, people are getting updates, people are seeing horrific images updated every hour on their phones. And what people are telling me is the concept of having access to clean water for many people has already ended. The concept of having available water at all may well for many people be in the final days now. There is an aquifer in Gaza, but that aquifer is saline. It's dependent on desalination. If neither fuel nor water is provided, then people say to me, who's going to run out of water first? The family that's evacuated because their home was bombed, or the Hamas fighter? Who's going to be more affected by the impossibility of importing medicines? Will it be the Hamas fighter, or will it be the people in a hospital? The people in the area say to me, when fuel runs out, desalination stops, but also in a hospital, who's going to have the backup power kept separate from the supplies? The Hamas fighter, or the people on life support, or a baby in an incubator? The impact of that decision is ticking. It's being felt now. People are already, on the information that's coming to me from people on the ground, are already much sicker as a result. And while it hasn't had the same attention as the direct bombing, in terms of the humanitarian impact of that siege, we are moments away from horrific impacts there from all the information that's coming to me from the community.
I've heard people describe it as a genocide. Do you see it that way?
I prefer to provide the facts as I just did, and I think your listeners will find their own words to be able to describe it. I think when we go straight to, do we use this word, do we use that word, we end up in an argument about linguistics. What I want to talk about is what's happening to individuals. And
what you're saying is that that's not... You are raising the alarm in relation to the blockade. You're saying that the blockade is a humanitarian disaster. Is that what you're saying?
The blockade has been there for in the order of 17 years. There has been since October, and I'm not understating the problems with that, but since October 7, there has been a siege, as announced by the Israeli Defence Minister. Since October 7, the announcement was no food, no water, no fuel. And for all the information that is coming to me from my part of Sydney, from the community that I represent, the people who are going to be most affected by that, the people who will die first as a result of that, are not Hamas. They are families who live in Gaza. Many of them live in Gaza already as refugees, who are now refugees again because they've evacuated. I've had people tell me of family members who evacuated from the north when they were told to, and then faced bombing on the way while they were seeking to evacuate. We need to be able to distinguish in the debate in Australia between Hamas and Palestinians. There have been too many occasions where the two have been conflated, and the military conflict is meant to be against Hamas.
Canterbury Bankstown Council has voted to raise the Palestinian flag until a ceasefire is declared in Palestine. That's in your electorate. Do you support it?
I support the decision completely. You need to understand, in my part of Sydney, people are watching every day death. They're watching every day images, sometimes of people they know, often of children. I had a professional woman say to me the other day, she has never seen so many images of dead babies in her life. Often the images they're seeing turn out to be of people they know. Everybody if I go through the suburbs across from Belmore, Lakemba, where I live in Punchbowl through to Bankstown, pretty much everybody knows somebody who has lost someone. And until the council made that decision, there was nowhere in Australia where those colours were being acknowledged as worthy of grieving. So when the councillor Coda Saleh, who's my local councillor, brought forward that resolution, and then the mayor BLL Hayek supported that resolution, which I might add was supported unanimously, they were truly representing the grief that is in the community. And once again, it is not the Hamas flag that's flying, it's the Palestinian flag. And it's a flag that gives people the chance to know that there is recognition and not selective grief. We can't say we only grieve for certain people who are slaughtered. We can't have a situation as a nation where we only formally acknowledge particular deaths. What happened on October the 7th was horrific and was rightly condemned by the Parliament and condemned by me, the condemnation of Hamas. We can't have that condemnation be added to by saying, as a result of condemnation, that's somehow weakened if you grieve for anybody else. That's somehow weakened if we do something to acknowledge the Palestinian loss of life.
So we know that the Opera House was lit up in the Israeli flag colours. Do you think that was the right call?
Look, the decision that was made, I agree with what Matthew Thistlethwaite said to you on Q&A the other night. Not all the listeners might have watched the episode, but when Matt said, as a general rule with the Opera House, the more we start to return it to an arts and cultural precinct, and it got to the point where it's been used for commercial advertising as well, that's the proper use for the Opera House, and it's sensible for us to start considering getting back to that. The concept of having places where people were able to grieve with the Israeli colours, with the Israeli flag, I respect absolutely, and don't disagree about having places to do that, separate to a decision about the Opera House. But in the same way, we have had, until Canterbury Bankstown Council made that decision, no parallel for the grief of Palestinians. And I'm really glad that the council made that decision. I'm very proud that it was my local council.
And should it happen more broadly in Australia at the moment, given the numbers that you have pointed to?
I suspect it will. And no one should view that. And some people will say, look, there's a really immature debate that we often fall into, where it says if you acknowledge anything in favour of the Palestinian people, or a claim that if in any way you acknowledge that there is a history that began before October 7, that somehow that's making excuses for Hamas. It's not. It's simply the case that people have a right to be able to grieve when innocent life is lost. And the concept of competitive grief, which certainly hasn't driven any of the interviews on this program, but has driven some of the media, is something that I don't want to see in Australia. I believe we do have the maturity, and we need to have the maturity to have the respect for each other's grief.
Does it also mean that your government needs to have a tougher line on Israel's bombardment and deprivation, as you say, water and food of the Israeli government? Do you need to use, you are right now, but everyone needs to be using stronger language to condemn it?
I think the words that I referred to earlier from Penny Wong yesterday were highly significant. That's right, she called for a pause, and the Australian government acknowledges that any country in the world after an attack like Hamas will want to respond directly to Hamas. That said, We want to protect every civilian life, and that includes civilian Palestinians. We want to make sure there is a proper humanitarian response. We don't want to see people starving. We don't want to see people without water. We don't want to see hospitals without power. We don't want to see, and we also want to be able to help get people out. I heard the interview earlier on this program today with respect to the government trying to get people out of Gaza. We have been able to get people out of Israel. We have been able to get people out of the West Bank. Of course, at the moment, no one can get anyone out of Gaza. And so while the government's still making best efforts there, there are people who Australia has a direct responsibility to, who we want to help get out. But there's also people who, simply because we have a strong view about the treatment of civilians, who have no direct personal link to Australia, but we still want civilians to be safe.
Just brief answer on this, if you can, because David Spears is waiting in the US to speak to us. Human rights organisations and legal experts have increasingly described Israel's policies towards Palestinians as apartheid. I know you've been there. You've been to the West Bank. Is that how you see it?
Look, once again, I don't want to get into the debate about the label. Certainly the description you gave is a description that Desmond Tutu had used. It's not a description that we use as a government. But let me just give this example. I've been to the military courts in the West Bank. Military courts where Palestinians are tried within the order of a 99% reported conviction rate. If two children throw a stone at a member of the Israeli Defence Force, one is Jewish, one is Palestinian. The legal consequences of that identical action are different depending on their race. Now, people can reach their own conclusions about what word to apply to that, but that's how the law works there at the moment.
Tony Burke, thank you.
Thanks for the chance to talk.
Tony Burke is the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. You're listening to ABC RN Breakfast.